My husband left me at 74 for his 28-year-old secretary. You're done. She will take your place. I just smiled. He had no idea that I had secretly transferred everything into my name 20 years ago. When the judge read out, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled." People always ask me how Richard and I managed to stay together for 51 years. I used to smile and say it was simple. Patience, coffee in the morning, and never going to bed angry. The truth was more complicated than that. But for a long time, I believed it myself. We lived in a colonial house on Brentwood Drive in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of street where neighbors still wave from their driveways and the mailman knows your name. Richard had built his accounting firm from nothing, starting in a rented room above a dry cleaner's on Fifth Avenue and growing it into a respectable mid-size practice with 11 employees and a corner office downtown. I had taught elementary school for 23 years, raised our 2 children, Carol and Dennis, kept the house, organized the holidays, buried both our mothers. We were not rich, but we were stable. We were, I thought, a unit. Retirement had softened the edges of things. Richard played golf on Tuesdays. I tended my garden and volunteered at the public library 2 afternoons a week, helping children with reading. We had grandchildren who called on Sundays. We had a routine, and for a woman of 74, a good routine is not a small thing. Looking back, I can see exactly when the texture of our life began to change. It was not dramatic at first. Nothing ever is, when it is happening to you from the inside. It started with his phone. Richard had never been a man attached to technology. He had resisted smartphones until Dennis essentially forced one into his hands at Christmas 3 years ago. But sometime in the spring of that last year together, I noticed he had begun carrying it everywhere, to the kitchen, to the bathroom. He started placing it face down on the dinner table, which he had never done before. Small thing. I filed it away and said nothing. Then came the late evenings at the office. The firm had a junior partner who could handle most of the workload now. Richard had been deliberately stepping back for 2 years. So when he began coming home after 8 o'clock on Tuesdays and Thursdays, citing year-end complications, I asked him once gently whether everything was all right. He looked at me over his glasses and said, "Peggy, you wouldn't understand the billing cycle if I drew you a diagram." That was his way of ending a conversation. I noticed the new shirts. He had always worn the same brands. Brooks Brothers when we could afford it, J.C. Penney when we couldn't. Now there were slim-cut things in pale blue and gray that did not suit a man of 76, shirts that looked as though someone younger had chosen them. I noticed that he had started using a different cologne. I noticed that he had begun watching what he ate, pushing away the bread basket at restaurants with a purposefulness that had never concerned him before. I told myself it was vanity. Older men sometimes renewed themselves that way. I told myself it was harmless. But there is a specific silence a marriage develops when something is wrong. Not the comfortable silence of 2 people who no longer need to fill every moment with words, but a different kind, hollow, pointed. Richard began to speak to me with a faint impatience that had never been there before, as though I were slightly in his way. Not cruel, not loud, just absent, in the way that is somehow worse than cruelty because it gives you nothing to push against. It was a Wednesday evening in October when it happened. I remember the light, gray and flat, the kind Ohio gets in the fall when the sky can't decide whether it's done with summer. I was setting the table for dinner when Richard walked in from the garage. He didn't take off his coat. He stood in the kitchen doorway and he looked at me the way a person looks at an old piece of furniture they've decided to donate. "Peggy," he said, "I need you to hear me. I've been seeing Tiffany, my assistant, for 14 months. I'm in love with her. I want a divorce. I put down the salad fork I was holding. She's 28, he continued, as if the number were an argument. We understand each other. You and I. We've run our course. You've had your life, Peggy. You've had everything. She deserves a chance, too. Then he said the words I will never forget, spoken with the quiet confidence of a man who believed he held every card in the deck. You've had your run. She'll take your place now. You've got nothing left that I need. I looked at him for a long moment, and then I smiled. He didn't know what to do with that smile. He never had. He slept in the guest room that night. Or rather, he didn't sleep there, because by 11 o'clock his car was gone from the driveway, and I was alone in the house on Brentwood Drive for the first time in what felt like my entire adult life. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I didn't cry right away. Grief, in my experience, doesn't arrive on schedule. What came first was something colder, a kind of audit. 51 years, 2 children, 1 house, a shared name, a life assembled from 10,000 ordinary days, and now a man standing in a doorway in his new slim-cut shirt telling me I had run my course. I was 74 years old. My hands, folded on the table in front of me, were the hands of a woman who had graded papers and baked pies and held her mother's hand as she died and signed every document Richard had ever put in front of her. Those hands had worked. They had earned things. And Richard, in his new cologne, believed that he could simply walk away from everything those hands had built and start over with a 28-year-old in his corner office. The fear came later, around 2 in the morning. I won't pretend it didn't. Fear is not weakness. It's information, and mine was telling me something important. I was a retired school teacher with a modest pension and Social Security. I had not practiced full-time for 11 years. The house, the investments, the savings account we had built over 5 decades. In Richard's mind, those belonged to the firm, to his effort, to his name. He had always handled the finances. He had always been the one who met with the accountant, signed the investment statements, reviewed the portfolio. That was, in his understanding, his domain. But Richard had a habit that had always quietly irritated me. He assumed that because I let him manage something, I didn't understand it. I got up from the table and walked to the small mahogany desk in the corner of what we called the study, though it was really just a room with bookshelves and an old computer and the filing cabinet where I kept my own papers. Not Richard's papers. Mine. I opened the bottom drawer. 20 years ago, in 2004, Richard had been going through a difficult period with the firm. A former partner had left under circumstances that involved the threat of a lawsuit. Nothing criminal, a dispute over billings and client accounts, but ugly enough that Richard had been genuinely frightened about liability. I remembered those months clearly, his stress, his sleeplessness, his fear that everything they had built could be seized if the lawsuit went badly. It was our attorney at the time, a careful woman named Helen Marsh, who had suggested the estate planning strategy. Transfer the personal assets into Peggy's name, she had told Richard. The house, the investment accounts, the joint savings. If the firm faces a judgment, personal property held in a spouse's name has additional protection. It's legal, it's common, and it's smart. Richard had agreed immediately. It had seemed to him like a formality, a protective measure that changed nothing real because, of course, what was mine was his, and what was his was mine. We were married. We were a unit. He had signed the documents without reading them carefully. He had trusted Helen, and he had trusted me, and he had moved on to the next crisis. I had read every word. The house on Brentwood Drive had been transferred to my name alone. The joint investment account, approximately $340,000 at the time, now considerably more, had been retitled in my name as sole owner. The savings account, the small rental property in Clintonville that Richard had bought in 1998 and largely forgotten about, which had appreciated to something significant. All of it legally was mine. I had never hidden this. It was in the records. Helen Marsh had retired, but the documents existed. Richard had simply never thought about it again, because in his mind the arrangement was symbolic, a legal technicality, not a real shift of ownership. He had kept managing everything as though it were jointly held, and I had let him, because for 20 years there had been no reason to say otherwise. Now there was a reason. I sat back in the chair and looked at the file. I was afraid, yes. I was heartbroken in the complicated way that you can be heartbroken by someone who's been disappointing you slowly for years. But underneath the fear and the grief, something else was settling into place, something quiet and precise. I picked up the phone and found the number for a family law attorney. Not Helen. Helen was retired. Someone new. Someone who specialized in divorce. I made an appointment for Friday morning. I did not call Richard. The office of Sandra Bellows, attorney at law, was on the 4th floor of a glass building on High Street. The kind of Columbus office where the carpet was the color of oatmeal and the receptionist offered you water with a professional smile. I arrived at 9 in the morning in my good wool coat, with the manila folder from Helen Marsh's original filings tucked under my arm and 20 years of careful record-keeping in my head. Sandra Bellows was perhaps 50, with reading glasses on a chain and the unhurried manner of someone who had sat across from frightened women for a long time and knew how to let them speak. I told her everything from the beginning: the marriage, the firm, the liability scare in 2004, the transfer of assets, Richard's announcement on Wednesday evening, Tiffany Cole. She listened without interrupting. Then she took the folder and read. After several minutes, she set it down and looked at me over her glasses. "Mrs. Harmon," she said, "do you understand what this actually says?" "I believe I do," I told her. "The house is titled solely in your name. So is the primary investment account, the joint savings, which is now technically not joint at all, and the Clintonville rental property." She paused. "Your husband signed these transfers in 2004. The documents are properly recorded with Franklin County. The conveyances were legal and fully executed at the time." "Yes," I said. "Then the short version is this. In a divorce proceeding, Ohio is an equitable distribution state. Courts look at marital property, but property that was legally retitled out of the marriage, particularly through a documented estate planning instrument signed by both parties, holds a different status." She chose her words carefully. "A good attorney will argue for equitable claims. Nothing is certain, but your starting position is considerably stronger than it might otherwise be." I asked her about the rental property specifically. She told me it had been generating income that I had been depositing into an account in my own name, which I had for convenience, because that had been the arrangement from the start. That paper trail was clean. I left Sandra's office 2 hours later with a legal pad of notes, a list of documents to gather, and the quiet understanding that Richard, when he filed for divorce, was going to receive a significant surprise. What I did not expect was how quickly he would begin to suspect something. By the following Tuesday, with barely a week after his announcement in the kitchen, I received a call from Dennis. My son was 47 and had his father's practical mind, though thank God not his capacity for cruelty. He sounded uncomfortable. "Mom, Dad called me. He said you've been acting strange. He wanted to know if you'd spoken to a lawyer. So, he was checking." "I'm fine, Dennis," I said. "Your father is the one filing for divorce. I'm simply getting my affairs in order." That evening, from my study window, I saw an unfamiliar car parked across the street for nearly 40 minutes. A dark blue sedan. I couldn't see the driver clearly. When I wrote down the license plate number and mentioned it to Sandra at our next meeting, she advised me to keep a log of any incidents that seemed like surveillance and to change the passwords on all my online accounts immediately. I did both. The concrete evidence of the affair's true timeline came from an unexpected direction. Carol, my daughter, had worked briefly as a freelance bookkeeper for Richard's firm 3 years prior. A short arrangement that had ended politely when the work dried up, or so I had thought. Carol called me on a Thursday evening, her voice careful and tight. "Mom, I need to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago. I'm sorry I didn't." Tiffany Cole had been hired as Richard's executive assistant 4 years ago, not 14 months ago as Richard had told me. Carol had seen things she hadn't known how to name at the time. Private dinners listed as client meetings, hotel charges on the firm's expense account, a familiarity between them that had unsettled her. She had told herself she was imagining it. She had not been imagining it. 4 years, not 14 months. 4 years. While I was tending my garden and volunteering at the library and making dinner, Richard had been conducting an entirely parallel life. I thanked Carol. I told her it was not her fault. And after I hung up, I sat for a moment with the simple, clarifying weight of the truth. There was no going back now. Not that I had intended to go back, but now I knew exactly what I was dealing with. Not a foolish old man startled into a midlife mistake. A calculated deception, sustained over years. I opened my legal pad and drew a line under the last item on the list. It was time to move from preparation to action. Sandra filed the formal response to Richard's divorce petition on a Monday morning. A 17-page document that, among other things, identified the asset transfers of 2004, listed the titled property, the investment accounts, and the rental income, and formally noted that the marital estate, as it currently stood on paper, was substantially composed of assets held in Margaret Ann Harmon's name alone. I had also, on Sandra's advice, sent certified letters to the 2 financial institutions where the investment and savings accounts were held, placing a notification of pending divorce proceedings on each account. Not a freeze, I didn't have the power to do that unilaterally, but a formal flag that would require both parties' authorization for significant transactions. The accounts could not simply be drained. I did not call Richard to tell him any of this. He found out the way he found out, when his own attorney received the filing and called him. I was deadheading roses in the back garden that Wednesday afternoon when I heard the car in the driveway. I didn't need to look up to know the sound of Richard's Buick, but there was a second set of footsteps on the brick path, lighter and quicker, and when I turned around, they were both standing at the gate. Tiffany Cole was younger in person than I had imagined her, and prettier in an aggressive, performative way. Hair highlighted to within an inch of its life, wearing a coat that cost more than our first car. She was holding Richard's arm like a document she had already signed. Richard's face was the color of old brick. "What in the hell have you done?" he said. I set down my pruning shears. "I filed a legal response to your petition," I said. "That's what people do when their spouse files for divorce." "You've tied up the accounts," he said. His voice had the particular quality of a man trying to control something that was escaping him. "You had no right. Those are marital assets, Peggy, and you know it." "My attorney disagrees," I said pleasantly. Tiffany stepped forward. "I will say this for her. She was not a timid person." "We know you're doing this to be vindictive," she said. "This is harassment. You're going to destroy Richard's business, and you know it." "I'm protecting my legal interests," I said. "That's not harassment. That's what the law is for." "You think you're so smart." Her voice had a sharp edge in it that she couldn't quite file down. "You're 74 years old. Do you really want to spend the rest of your life in a courtroom? Because we will fight this. Every piece of it. We will be there every single day until you have nothing left but legal bills." I looked at her. Then I looked at Richard, at the man I had shared a bed with for 51 years, who was standing in my rose garden with his 28-year-old girlfriend trying to frighten me. "Richard," I said, "you signed those documents in front of a notary with Helen Marsh as your attorney. I didn't forge your signature." His jaw tightened. "This isn't over," he said. "I know," I said. "That's what courts are for." They left. I heard the Buick back out of the driveway with more speed than necessary, and then the street was quiet again, and it was just me and the roses and the flat gray Ohio sky. I went inside and made tea. My hands were steady. I was rather proud of that. But that night, alone, the fear came back. Not the paralyzing kind, but the low, persistent kind that lives in the chest and makes it hard to sleep. They were not wrong that a prolonged legal fight would cost money and time and energy. Tiffany's voice had the particular certainty of someone who had thought this through and believed she held leverage. And Richard had built a professional life on knowing how to negotiate, how to wear people down, how to wait. I was 74. What if this took 2 years, 3? Sandra had told me to expect delays, had told me to prepare myself. I gave myself 4 days. I told no one what was happening except Carol and Dennis, who both came to the house on Saturday and sat at the kitchen table with me, and Carol held my hand while Dennis made pasta, and we talked about everything except the case, and for a few hours the house felt like a house again instead of a battlefield. By Thursday I was rested. By Thursday I was ready. The offer arrived through Richard's attorney, a Mr. Gerald Fitch, whose correspondence Sandra described as aggressive in tone but weak in foundation. It came on a cream envelope with a return address in Bexley, and I read it at my kitchen table with a second cup of coffee. The offer was, on its surface, not unreasonable. A lump sum settlement of $180,000, drawn from what Richard described as marital savings, plus the right to remain in the house on Brentwood Drive for a period of 2 years, after which the house would be sold and proceeds split equally. The rental property in Clintonville would go to Richard. The investment accounts, Richard's attorney argued, had been maintained primarily through Richard's professional income and should be treated as marital assets subject to equitable division. I read it twice. It was, I had to give them credit, artfully constructed. To a woman who didn't have Sandra Bellows or the 2004 documents or 20 years of retained filing receipts, it might have looked like a reasonable exit. Cash, shelter, a clean break. It was designed to look like generosity while quietly moving the most valuable asset, the Clintonville rental property, back into Richard's hands and establishing the investment accounts as jointly marital rather than individually titled. I called Sandra. The rental property alone, Sandra told me, appraised last year at $410,000. It generates approximately $2,800 a month in rental income. They want you to walk away from that in exchange for $180,000 and a 2-year lease on your own house. Yes, I said. That's what I thought it said. My strong recommendation is a counter that holds all titled property as your separate asset and opens negotiation only on items that are genuinely marital. Draft it, I said. I did not call Richard. I did not respond to Tiffany's text message, which came through Carol's phone. Tiffany had somehow obtained Carol's number, which was its own kind of message, and which read, with what I imagined was studied casualness, "Tell your mom this offer won't be on the table forever. She should think about what she actually wants at her age." I had thought about it extensively. What I wanted was what was legally mine. The counter was filed the following week, and after that there was a silence from Richard's side that Sandra said was typical. They were recalibrating. For about 10 days, I heard nothing directly. No cars parked across the street. No calls through Carol. Richard's attorney sent a brief and somewhat coldly worded acknowledgement of our counter filing and indicated that they were reviewing the matter. It was during those 10 days that I found, or rather refound, something I hadn't leaned on in years: other women. There was a group at the library, not my volunteer shift, a different afternoon, that had been running for 3 years, organized by a woman named Deirdre Moss, who'd gone through her own divorce at 68. It wasn't called a support group. Officially, it was a reading and discussion group. But the books they chose had a habit of centering women navigating late-life upheaval, and the discussions had a habit of going well beyond the text. I had known about it and never attended because I had a marriage and had not needed it. I needed it now. The first afternoon I walked in, there were 7 women around the table, ranging in age from 61 to 80. I didn't announce my situation. I sat down and listened. By the second week, I had told them the outline. By the third, I had told them everything. And a woman named Barbara, who had been a paralegal for 30 years before she retired, had offered to review my filing documents as a second set of eyes, which Sandra had no objection to. Deirdre told me about her own experience with an asset dispute and the specific Ohio statute her attorney had used. I already knew it. Sandra had cited it. But hearing it from Deirdre across a table with a cup of library-grade coffee made it feel less like legal abstraction and more like a door with a handle I could actually reach. I was not alone. That was the essential thing. I had been living inside this story by myself, keeping it away from the neighbors on Brentwood Drive and the other library volunteers and the grandchildren. Bringing it out into a room with other people, careful people, experienced people, changed something in my posture. They were watching. Richard and Tiffany were watching, recalibrating, waiting for me to get tired or frightened into accepting something inadequate. I was not going to get tired. They came on a Sunday afternoon in November, which I thought was deliberately chosen. Sunday suggests domesticity, truce, the softening of the week's end. I was in the kitchen making soup when I saw Richard's Buick pull into the driveway, and I had just enough time to set down the wooden spoon and straighten my shoulders before they knocked. Tiffany was wearing less war paint than the last time. She had dressed, I noticed, carefully. A plain sweater, minimal jewelry, the costume of approachability. Richard was in the kind of casual clothes he wore on weekends when he was making an effort to seem relaxed. They stood on the porch like people who believed they were coming to reason with someone. I opened the door. I did not invite them in immediately. "Peggy," Richard said, his voice carrying the specific register he used when he wanted something. Lower, slower. The voice of a man who knows how to perform sincerity. "Can we come in? We just want to talk." I let them in. I did not offer coffee. I sat in the armchair by the window, which was my chair in my house, and I waited. Tiffany sat on the couch and folded her hands, and she looked at me with an expression she had clearly rehearsed. Something calibrated to suggest remorse without actually performing it. Richard remained standing for a moment, then sat beside her. "We didn't come here to fight," he said. "I know things have been hostile. I know the lawyers are involved and it's getting complicated. But Peggy, we've known each other for over 50 years. I don't want this to get ugly." "It's already gotten ugly," I said. "You told me I'd run my course." "A beat." He glanced at Tiffany. "I was emotional," he said. "I said things I shouldn't have. That's fair." He spread his hands on his knees, a gesture I recognized from the hundreds of times I'd watched him negotiate, with clients, with contractors, with our children. But dragging this through the courts isn't going to be good for anyone. The legal costs alone. Sandra Bellows doesn't come cheap, Peggy. Neither does Gerald Fitch. We could spend 3 years and $200,000 between us just to end up at the same place. "And where do you imagine that place is?" I asked. Tiffany leaned forward slightly. "We just want a clean separation," she said. Her voice was smoother now than it had been in the garden. She'd worked on it. "Something reasonable for everyone. Richard is willing to be more than fair. The offer we sent was a genuine gesture." "It was a very interesting gesture," I said. "It would have given me $180,000 and a temporary lease on my own house in exchange for walking away from $400,000 in real property and an investment account I own outright. I'm not sure that's the same thing as fair." Something shifted in Tiffany's eyes, a tightening. She recovered quickly, but I had seen it. Richard tried again. "Peggy, you're 74 years old. Think about what you're doing to yourself. The stress of litigation at your age. Your doctor would tell you the same thing. Is this really worth your health?" There it was. I had been waiting for it. The appeal to my age, my health, my fragility, the implication that a woman of 74 ought to be grateful for a smaller fight and a faster exit. that her years were a liability, that the sensible thing was to fold gracefully. "My doctor," I said, "says I have the blood pressure of a woman 15 years younger. I walk 2 miles a day. I plan to be in excellent health for quite some time." Tiffany's hands unfolded. Richard's jaw moved. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said, and the rehearsed softness had mostly left her voice now. "You know what's going to happen in court? They're going to look at 20 years of those accounts being managed jointly, contributions made from marital income, and they're going to say the title change doesn't supersede equitable claims. You're going to spend 2 years and come out with less than we're offering you now." "That's possible," I said. "It's also possible they won't. I have a very good attorney." "We'll countersue," Richard said. "We'll argue the 2004 transfer was legally executed," I said, "in the presence of a notary with your attorney of record present, while you were of sound mind and under no duress. Helen Marsh kept excellent records. I've already requested them." The room was quiet. They left without further argument, but the last look Tiffany gave me from the doorway was not the look of a woman retreating. It was the look of a woman calculating, and that, I will admit, followed me into that evening and sat with me while I finished my soup. But the fear, as it had before, became something harder underneath. They had come here expecting to find an old woman who could be managed. What they had found instead was a woman who had read every document she had ever signed. I went to bed early. I slept well. The hearing was set for a Tuesday in February, which in Columbus means gray sky and road salt, and the specific cold that settles in through the soles of your shoes while you stand on a courthouse sidewalk. I arrived 20 minutes early in my good coat, the same one I'd worn to Sandra's office, with a leather folder containing every document we had assembled over the previous 4 months. Sandra met me in the corridor outside courtroom 6 on the 3rd floor. She looked the way good attorneys look before a hearing, calm in the way that is not the absence of awareness, but the management of it. "They filed a supplemental brief last week," she reminded me. "Richard's attorney is going to argue that the 2004 transfers were made under duress. Specifically, that Richard signed under the pressure of the litigation threat, and that the documents were presented to him in a way that minimized his ability to fully comprehend their long-term implications." "He was a 53-year-old accountant," I said, "with his own attorney present." "Yes," Sandra said, "that is essentially our response." The courtroom was modest. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights, the standard atmosphere of bureaucratic permanence. Richard sat at the table to the left with Gerald Fitch, who was a compact, precise-looking man with silver hair and the confidence of someone who billed at $400 an hour. Tiffany was in the gallery. She had no standing as a party, but she was there, in a gray suit, with the careful stillness of someone performing composure. Richard looked older than he had in the garden in October. The months had done something to the set of his face, tightened it, hollowed it slightly. He did not look at me when I took my seat. The judge was the Honorable Patricia Wynne, mid-60s, with reading glasses and an expression of judicial neutrality that did not entirely conceal a certain efficiency of attention. She had, I would learn, handled family court for 11 years. Gerald Fitch presented the duress argument with considerable skill. He painted a picture of a man in his early 50s under genuine professional stress, presented with complex legal documents by a wife who was, and here the word choices were careful, more familiar with the domestic management of the household's finances than the respondent was aware. He suggested that Richard's signing had been reflexive, trusting, not fully informed. It was a reasonable argument. I had expected it. Sandra's response was methodical. She entered the 2004 documents. She entered the notarization records. She entered the correspondence from Helen Marsh's office, which Helen, now retired in Scottsdale, had provided willingly after a single phone call from Sandra, along with a sworn written statement confirming that Richard had been fully advised of the nature and effect of each transfer. He had asked questions. Helen had answered them. He had signed. Then Sandra entered the expense account records from Richard's firm, the ones Carol had provided, which showed hotel charges over a 4-year period inconsistent with any documented business travel. Not to prove adultery, Sandra explained to the court. Ohio's equitable distribution does not require proof of fault, but to establish the timeline of relevant events and to contextualize Richard's stated motivations. That was when Richard's composure began to go. "This is irrelevant," Gerald Fitch said, rising. "The timeline of the petitioner's relationship with Ms. Cole is directly relevant to the characterization of marital assets and the period of their accumulation," Sandra said without raising her voice. Judge Wynn allowed it. And then Tiffany made her error. I saw it from across the room. A physical thing. A visible tension that crossed her face when the hotel records went up on the display screen, dates and locations. A 4-year map of a life Richard had been conducting in parallel with ours. She leaned forward in the gallery and said something to the woman beside her, audible enough that the bailiff turned. Judge Wynn looked up from the documents. "The gallery will remain silent," she said, in a tone that had clearly silenced galleries before. Tiffany sat back, but the moment had registered. Judge Wynn's eyes went to Tiffany, then to Richard, with the flat attentiveness of someone adding a column of numbers she had seen before. Richard at the table had his hands pressed flat on the surface in front of him. His attorney leaned over and said something quiet. Richard nodded, but his jaw was set in the way it had set in the garden in October, the way it set when he was losing a negotiation and knew it. "Mrs. Harmon," Judge Wynn said, addressing me directly for the first time, "the documentation before the court indicates the property transfers of 2004 were executed with proper legal counsel on both sides, full notarization, and no evidence of procedural defect. Is that your understanding?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "It is." She wrote something on the pad in front of her, and I sat in the courtroom in my good wool coat, with my hands folded in my lap, and felt not triumph, not yet, but the particular ground-level steadiness of a woman who has done everything correctly and is now simply waiting for the math to work out. The math was going to work out. Judge Wynn issued her ruling 3 weeks after the hearing on a Thursday morning. Sandra called me at 9:15. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee, and I had the particular stillness that comes after months of not being still. The stillness of someone who has waited a very long time for a specific piece of information. "She ruled in your favor on the primary asset questions," Sandra said. She was using her professional voice, which was measured and precise, but I could hear something underneath it that was not quite professional. The satisfaction of a clean outcome after a complex case. The 2004 transfers are upheld as legally valid conveyances. The house, the investment accounts, and the Clintonville rental property are recognized as your separate titled property. The duress argument was rejected in full. Judge Wynn noted specifically that the presence of independent legal counsel on both sides, combined with Helen Marsh's sworn statement confirming the advisory process, left no credible basis for the claim. I set down my coffee cup. The equitable division applies to Richard's pension, the portion accumulated during the marriage, and the remaining joint checking account, which was genuinely marital and will be split. You'll retain the house and the investment accounts without division. The rental property is yours. The total net value of the separate property is, she paused slightly, approximately $890,000 at current appraised values, plus the ongoing rental income. The line was quiet for a moment. "Sandra," I said, "thank you." "You built a clean case, Peggy. You kept everything in order for 20 years. I didn't say what I was thinking, which was, I kept it in order because Helen Marsh told me to, and because I read every document she put in front of me, and because no one had ever been able to convince me that understanding something was someone else's job. It had never felt like strategy. It had felt like paying attention, but paying attention, I was learning, is its own kind of power. I thanked Sandra again and asked about next steps and wrote down the items she listed with my steady hands. I learned about Richard's reaction the following day through Carol, who had heard it from Dennis, who had spoken to his father. Richard had been at Gerald Fitch's office when the ruling was relayed. He had, by Dennis's account, put his fist on the conference table. Not a blow, just the pressure of a man who was trying very hard not to become something he couldn't walk back from. He had said, according to Dennis's careful paraphrasing, that it was impossible, that 50 years of contribution couldn't simply be erased by a piece of paper he'd signed in a law office in 2004 when he hadn't understood the full implications. Dennis had not disagreed exactly, but Dennis had also said quietly to his father, "Dad, Helen Marsh's sworn statement says you asked about the implications. She says she explained them. I don't know what to tell you." Richard had no answer to that. He sat in the chair across from his attorney and was silent for a long time, in the particular silence of a man confronting the gap between the story he had told himself and the documented record of what had actually occurred. Gerald Fitch, to his credit, did not try to fill that silence with false comfort. Tiffany, I later heard through the legal proceedings that trickled into record, because financial matters have a way of becoming visible when you look for them, had been under the impression for the 4 years of their relationship that Richard was a considerably wealthier man than he had turned out to be. The accounting firm was profitable, yes, but its primary asset was its client relationships and Richard's professional reputation. Without the house, the investment accounts, the rental property, without what had been quietly his wife's, Richard's independent financial position was substantially less impressive than Tiffany had calculated. She had built a life around a number that had never been real. That, I suppose, is the particular cruelty of assumptions. They hold until they don't, and by then the ledger is already settled. I did not learn this with satisfaction. I learned it with the flat recognition of someone who had always known, somewhere, that the arithmetic was going to clarify itself eventually. The divorce was finalized in April. Richard signed the final decree in Gerald Fitch's office. I signed in Sandra's. We were in different rooms, which struck me as appropriate. We had been in different rooms for a long time, really, even when we were in the same house. When Sandra handed me my copy of the signed decree, she said nothing dramatic. She simply said, "It's done, Peggy," and shook my hand, and that was the right way for it to happen. I went home afterward. It was a Thursday evening, mild for April, the kind of evening where you can leave the kitchen window open and hear the neighborhood settling into its quiet. I made dinner for one, a thing I was learning to do without the particular self-consciousness of the newly alone, and I ate it at the kitchen table, and afterward I sat for a little while with the silence. 51 years, one house, one name, which I kept, because it was also my children's name and my grandchildren's name, and because I had earned it as surely as I had earned anything else in my life. I thought about the woman who had sat at this table in October and audited her life and found it still solid. I thought, well done, Peggy. And then I washed the dishes, because that is what you do, and the evening went on. By October, 1 year almost to the day from the evening Richard stood in my kitchen doorway, the house on Brentwood Drive had become something I had not expected, a pleasure. I had lived in it for 41 years as a married woman, which is to say I had lived in it as one half of a negotiated arrangement, every room shaped by someone else's preferences as much as my own. The study had been Richard's territory. The garage had been Richard's. The television in the living room had defaulted to Richard's choices. Small things, accumulated over decades. Now I repainted the study a warm sage green and put a reading chair in the corner where his desk had been. I gave the television away to Dennis's family because I found I preferred the radio in the evenings and the particular quality of silence that comes from a room with books in it. I cleared out the garage and turned half of it into a proper potting shed for the garden, with a workbench and good shelving and the kind of organized chaos that belongs entirely to me. I signed up for a watercolor class at the Columbus Museum of Art, which met on Wednesday mornings. I had always wanted to paint and had always deferred it for reasons I could not now precisely remember. The instructor was a young woman named Priya, who had the cheerful directness of someone who genuinely loves what she teaches, and the class was full of women my age and older, who were, all of us, doing something we had put off, and the studio smelled of linseed oil and the particular contentment of people using their hands. Deirdre Moss's reading group continued. Barbara, the retired paralegal, had become a real friend, the kind you call on a Tuesday evening for no particular reason. Carol came to dinner every Sunday. Dennis brought the grandchildren on Saturday afternoons, and I taught the oldest one, Emma, who was 10 and serious, how to deadhead roses. The Clintonville rental property, mine outright, had a new tenant, a young couple with a baby, and the rental income covered my property taxes and utilities with money to spare. And I invested the rest carefully with a financial advisor Sandra had recommended, a woman named Joyce who explained every decision in plain language and never once suggested I wouldn't understand it. I was, I found, well. Unexpectedly, specifically, practically well. As for Richard, the accounting firm without the underpinning of the personal assets that Richard had always considered a backstop, faced the financial realities of a man in his mid-70s running a business that was worth less without him in it. Gerald Fitch had been expensive. The years of hotel charges and supplementary income directed toward his other life had left gaps. He sold his stake in the firm to the junior partners in the spring. Not badly, but not on the terms he would have chosen. He moved into an apartment in Bexley. It was, by all reports, a comfortable apartment. It was also an apartment. Tiffany Cole did not stay. I did not learn the specifics from anyone who knew them directly. But Carol, who had a colleague who knew people at the firm, mentioned it in passing that spring, in the careful way adult children convey information about the other parent. The relationship had not survived the financial recalibration. Tiffany had moved back to her own apartment in the short north by February. She had found a different position at a different firm. She was 29 now, and her life was her own, and I had no particular feeling about that one way or the other. What I did have a feeling about, a clear and settled feeling, was this: that the choices people make in the middle of their lives have arithmetic. They compound. Richard had spent 4 years constructing a parallel world on a financial foundation that had never actually been his. And when the foundation was properly titled, the world came down to its actual proportions. That was not my revenge. That was simply the consequence of things as they were. I thought about this one afternoon in September, sitting in the garden with a cup of tea and the particular satisfaction of a garden that has made it through summer. The roses had done well this year. The hydrangeas were still going. The light was the warm, slanted kind that Ohio gets in September before it withdraws. I'd been afraid in October of the previous year that I was looking at the end of something. I was not. I had been looking at the end of one version of my life and the beginning of another, and the second version was quieter and more entirely mine. That seemed, all things considered, like a reasonable trade. People ask me if I regret any of it. I don't. I regret the years I assumed that understanding something was someone else's job. I don't regret the documents. I don't regret the lawyer. I don't regret the roses. Here is what I learned. Read everything you sign, know what you own, and never let anyone convince you that your years make you smaller. What would you have done in my place? Would you have taken the first offer? I'd genuinely like to know. If this story stayed with you, share it. Leave a comment below, and thank you, truly, for listening.